During the years we lived at the Scop place, Dad made a profession of faith at church one Sunday. I scolded him and Mom on the way home for crying in public. This decision may have added to the strain between our family and Grandpa Adams. Dad was a very special person, and liked to take part in whatever was going on in the neighborhood. He had dreamed of being a schoolteacher as a boy, and I doubt if that desire ever truly left him. He often taught the adults in Sunday school or acted as superintendent. He liked to organize what he called literary societies that met in the schoolhouse on Friday nights. These meetings consisted of debates in kangaroo courts, mock trials. Dad preferred to moderate these, but he would debate if needed. I remember hearing the debate when the question was which is the most destructive, fire or water. In these debates, if a point could be proven by a verse from the Bible, the discussion was over. Mom never took part in the debates, but she would coach Dad at home. She refused to go to the kangaroo court after some smoldering resentment between participants almost led to a fight. It was amazing how much Dad and Mom knew about so many subjects. Both were readers, Mom especially, so you bookworms came by that love honestly. Both were interested in the world beyond the little communities where they live. When Leo and I went away to high school, Mom insisted that we bring our textbooks home so she could read them. Dad liked to have something going on around him, so our barnyard often had croquet, marble, or ball games played there on the weekends. I have memories of seeing him run around the bases and of Mom jumping rope longer than I could. As the years went by, Grandpa made less and less impression on my memories. The other family members visited us fairly often. Uncle Felbert would arrive on his horse, Grandma and the aunts walked or came in a buggy. During the winter that Estelle was born, I stayed at Grandma's to go to school because we lived too far away for me to walk. We attended the Harmon School where Ralph and Fred had gone when the family first moved to Boone County. Aunt Delia assumed the chore of getting me ready for school each morning, including braiding of my long hair. My hair had never been cut because Mom thought a girl's hair was her glory and that it was a sin to cut it. The fashion of the day was bobbed hair. Long hair was considered to be terribly old-fashioned. Aunt Delia tried to keep up with the latest fads as pictured in the Sears catalog, so one day, she cut my hair. I wasn't in on the scene that occurred between her and Mom over that, but there must have been flying feathers. Whatever Mom said to Aunt Delia brought some kind of action out of Grandpa Adams, the only time I ever heard of its happening. He walked the 3 miles to our house, bad leg and all, called her out of the house and proceeded cuss her out. He called her names and vented all of the hostility he felt toward her Christian lifestyle. She said she had never heard such language. Poor Dad, I wonder where he was in all that? The scene must have caused terrible tension between the families. I don't remember Grandpa or Grandma ever visited our home again. I do know when I was 12 years old and went to stay at their house to work in the cannery with Aunt Delia, she didn't cut my hair. I took care of that chore myself soon after I returned home, ignoring Mom's reproachful face. Grandpa survived Grandma about 5 years. They had moved from the log house to a white house on the hilltop near Piatt, Arkansas. It was larger and nicer than the old house. It overlooked a beautiful valley. There was a porch across the front and an L-shaped one the back. Aunt Delia had a larger sparking room and by then a steady boyfriend who came to visit her in a chugging Model T. Grandma's beloved stove reigned over a smaller kitchen, but there was a separate dining room with windows all along one side. Uncle Felbert brought Aunt Jewel to live there as a 16-year-old bride. Aunt Delia took her under her wing and treated her like one of us kids. Their first child, Maxine, was born while they lived there. She was not only their pride and joy, but Aunt Delia's as well. Grandma was diagnosed as having cancer of the uterus in the summer of 1931. She was very sick and the doctor could do little for her except leave morphine pills for her to take. As the cancer invaded other parts of her body, she could eat no solid food, but in her delirium would beg to be fed. She often asked for light bread, which meant the sliced bread from the store. One day, without telling anyone he was going, Grandpa walked down the hill to Piatt, into one of the stores there and asked to buy a loaf of bread on credit. The man behind the counter had never seen that crippled old man, so he refused to sell him the bread. Grandpa was deeply hurt by this, for he always had been known as an honest man. He felt the refusal was an insult to his integrity. Uncle Thelbert went to the store in anger and told the man what he could do with his whole store. I don't think any in the Adams family ever went inside that place again. Uncle Jim opened a store in Piatt not long after that, and most of our shopping was done there. Grandma died just as a winter sunset lit the western sky with shades of purple and rose. Dad and I had been there a week at that time. We had come to help in the constant care Grandma required. I didn't do much except help prepare food and take care of Maxine. I remember the quietness of the house as Grandma's body was laid out on boards in the living room. Neighbors sit there all night as was the custom in those days, permitting the exhausted family to try to sleep. Dad and I went back home to bring the rest of family to the funeral the next day. Mom was pregnant with Claude, so only Dad and the oldest of us kids went. There was a service in living room where Grandma died, so was late in the afternoon when the funeral caravan reached the Crawford Cemetery. In the neighborhood where Grandma's family had lived in that log house. It was a bitterly cold day. Many of the people had ridden on the beds of pickup trucks, including Dad and us kids. Several people who lived near the cemetery had gathered in the little white church. A short service was conducted and the casket was open for viewing. Something so unsettling happened and that Ralph and I find difficulty in discussing it even today. Dad had been sitting near the stove, trying to get warm after that bone-chilling ride. He rose to go take a final look at Grandma's face, taking all us kids with him. He began to shake uncontrollably and cried out, "No, she can't be dead." And to everyone's horror put his arms around her body and tried to lift her from the casket. The other men rushed to him, loosened his arms and led him to the corner of the room. He was crying hysterically and shaking as with a violent chill. Coats were thrown around his shoulders and his brothers and sisters tried to soothe him. The rest of the crowd quietly closed the casket, carried it out to the waiting grave and buried her. Dad became calmer. He gathered his scared kids around him, still sobbing, told us what a wonderful mother Grandma had been and how much trouble he had caused her, not true, according to his siblings, and how he regretted any worry he had caused her. He then proceeded to tell us, "You kids also have a wonderful mother and I want you to always be good to her and make her proud of you, for someday she will be gone and you won't know till then how much she means to you." He said other good things about Mom that I wonder if he ever expressed to her. When he was calm enough to go home, someone saw to it that he rode inside a car or he was still weak and shaken. I never heard him mention this incident afterward. I know that when Grandpa died for 5 years later there was much apprehension among his brothers and sisters that the same thing might happen again, but he was the calmest of them all. I remember that it was he who comforted them that day. The last years of Grandpa's life were lived in Aunt Delia's house. Thelbert and Jewel's family had grown and their hands were full. Delia had married Henry Lancaster when she was about 34 years old. In November 1934 Grandpa's skin became very jaundiced and the doctor found that he had cancer of the stomach and liver. Delia was pregnant at the time and was sick most of the time. So I went to live at her house and help take care of Grandpa and do whatever she needed. I went to school from there during the 8th grade year. In return for my helping her, Aunt Delia bought the sheets and towels I needed to enter the School of Ozarks that summer. She also paid for my first permanent. It cost $1 and sent me on top of the world. Through staying there that year and helping look after him I got to know Grandpa a little bit better, for which I have always been grateful. He still didn't have much to say, but he would answer my questions as I washed his face and hands and combed his thick, white hair. "You shiny top men didn't get your baldness from Grandpa, often wonder where Dad got his." The last few weeks of his life were spent in bed and someone had to be constantly by his side. His children came often to help. The house seemed to be full of relatives, sleeping whenever and wherever they could. He was delirious most of his last day and he thought I was Aunt Bessie who happened not to be there that day. So I was at his bedside a lot that day, wiping his damp brow with a cold towel. Ralph, Leo, and I remember well the day he died that neither of us can remember a funeral for him, or his burial. I have asked various cousins and no one recalls a funeral service. I'm sure there was one, his children would have seen to that, but it certainly didn't impress upon the memories of his grandchildren. He died in February 1935, a month before Betty Lou was born. Grandma Adams. Memories of Grandma are almost all pleasant. Nothing aloof or silent about her. She was a short, compact little lady with warm brown eyes and long brown hair. She was frank and outspoken, seemed never to be involved in family squabbles. She was industrious, always bustling about, taking care of her house, garden, and chickens. She never saw a stranger and helped deliver the babies in the communities where they live. Mom told me that on the cold December night when I was born, Grandma came in the door, shaking snow off her coat, and said, "Bertha, this one had better be a girl." Ralph and Fred were the only grandchildren up till then, and I doubt if Mom would have dared had another boy after Grandma's remark. Grandma always spoon-fed catnip tea to the babies she delivered. Today they say it is slightly narcotic, but Grandma's babies thrived on. At the time the family moved to Boone County, Grandma didn't have a stove to cook meals on. All food was cooked in an open fireplace. The rules: there were several hooks for big pots of beans, turnips, and stews, and a covered Dutch oven for baking. These were all made of very heavy iron. She would set the Dutch oven on a bed of hot coals and put more coals on top of it. Inside might be biscuits, cornbread, or even cake. The food was delicious, but stooping into the fireplace to check on or stir it was a hot, exhausting job, and Grandma wanted a stove. Not a tiny one, set up on a wooden box like Bertha's, but one of the newfangled ones like she saw in the catalog, with a reservoir for hot water and warming oven stove. There was no money to buy such a stove. That didn't stop enterprising Grandma for long. From a neighbor she bought 4 or 5 turkey eggs for a few pennies. She placed them under a setting hen who obligingly hatched them out for her. Grandma took personal charge of raising these turkeys, being sure they arrived at egg-laying age in good shape. Turkeys like to hide their nest from prying eyes and fingers, and Ralph remembers helping her look for their nest. This had to be done very quietly, for the turkey saw you looking for her nest, she would seem to ignore you, as she continued pecking for food, and would lead you away from her nest to the furthest corner of the field, away from her nest. But Grandma was more than a match for sneaky turkeys, so she had a nice flock of them to sell that fall. The stove was bought, and what a stove it was! Gleaming black, trimmed with shining chrome, with a bunch of purple porcelain grapes in the center of the oven door. Grandma and Delia loved it, and it was used almost non-stop. I think they tried every recipe in their tattered home comfort cookbook. The heavenly aromas that floated out of the kitchen can't be described. Ralph and I recall that we could always find a between-meal snack in the warming oven above the cooking surface of the stove. It might be biscuits and a sausage or piece of ham to put between slices of homemade bread or baked sweet potato. In the dish cabinet with its pierced tin doors, there was usually cake or pie. Grandma and all her daughters were marvelous cooks, and that is not just nostalgia. In 1983, Elva, Owen, and I were in Yakima, Washington, in the home of Aunt Della and Aunt Retta. A big dinner had been prepared for all the relatives in Aunt Delia's house on Sunday. Aunt Retta was nearly 90 years old, but she had gotten up at 2 o'clock that morning to bake a lemon cake, several pies, and to prepare a special salad that she had only recently learned how to make. All were delicious. For a lady who had her beginning cooking lessons using open fireplace, she certainly knows how to cook in an ultra-modern kitchen. She lives in a retirement complex and bakes goodies for the other residents, in addition to sharing fresh vegetables with them, which she grows in a garden outside her back door. There was a creaky porch swing at the front of the log cabin home. It was really pleasant to sit there with Grandma and listen to her talk. I don't remember anything specific she talked about, but she must have encouraged questions, for I do remember that she told me babies came out of knots on trees. Leo's arrival must have triggered that question. Grandma's answer puzzled me. Aunt Delia had told me a few days before they came out of cabbage heads. A few years later Fred learned the real story and passed it on to me. Fred was a great older brother and kept me informed about such things. Dad was better communicating the facts of life to his sons than Mom was at informing her daughters. Grandma's house and person were always immaculate. In my memory she seemed always to be wearing a dark dress with a white collar and apron. In those days all the married ladies wore aprons every day. The older ones wore even more fancy ones to church, sometimes with a bonnet to match. Grandma wore high-top shoes that fastened with buttons. Sometimes I was allowed to button them for her. The loop end of a large hairpin was pushed through the buttonhole and hooked around the button. The hairpin was then pulled back to the buttonhole, with the button in tow. Grandma in turn often combed and braided my hair. Somehow her hands seemed more gentle than Aunt Delia's or even Mom's. I would almost always fall asleep sitting on the floor at her feet. I know now that it was a blessing to have been the first daughter and granddaughter in this family. It was special place but not as special as the one occupied by Ralph as first son and grandson. Mom said she had more time to teach him good manners and other things that she just didn't have as more and more children came along. If you'd have seen pictures of Ralph as a child you know he was adorable, and I think he still is. We both have warm memories of our childhoods, in spite of the poverty and hard times. We feel that we were surrounded by love and attention. His favorite uncle was Jesse and his favorite aunts were Bessie and Delia, the oldest and youngest of the aunts. Aunt Bessie was more like Grandma than any of her daughters. She has the same soft brown eyes and gentle spirit. None of us can recall ever hearing Aunt Bessie lift her voice to anyone, as Estelle commented at her funeral. Most have spent time in her home, as children. She made my first pick sack to take to the cotton fields out of a 10-pound sugar sack. Her stepdaughter was a few years older than I, and some of her clothes reached me by the hand-me-down route. I remember a ruffled white dress that I was so proud of. One Sunday afternoon during the usual baseball game someone, Fred, threw a ball that hit my nose and blood dripped on the dress. Aunt Bessie had long dark hair that she put into 2 braids at night. Aunt Delia was also one of my favorites. She used no flattery, pulled no punches and spoke her mind, and I was always a little in awe of her. I thought she was very beautiful, her blonde hair a novelty in this family of dark-haired ones. She taught me many things that have been a blessing all my life. In her letters to me she addresses me as my dear little niece. She thinks I'm still about 5 years old. It must have been shattering to both my grandparents when they lost the old farm that we all love so much they could not make payments on. It was the last years of the 1920s and the drought years had begun. The stock market had crashed and shockwaves from that were felt even in the hills of Arkansas in the low prices for products from the farms and high prices for necessities from the stores. Grandma's health began to fail and the move from Piatt seemed to drain her of strength and ambition. She lived about a year after they moved. Fred said that in speaking of Grandma soon after she died, Grandpa said to him, "The first time I saw her I thought she was the prettiest girl I ever saw, she was the most beautiful bride I ever seen, and she was the prettiest corpse I've ever seen." As far as we know he was able to share his grief with Fred only. The summer before she died Fred stayed at her house to help Uncle Thelbert with the tomato crop. The team Fred was driving spooked and ran away one day, throwing Fred out of the wagon. He broke a leg and spent the rest of the summer on crutches. He came home to let the leg heal and made a family pet of a young pig we had. Her name was Betsy. Her descendants were pork chops for several years. Fred's broken bone was the only one suffered by any of us in our growing up years of rough and tumble wrestling, tree climbing, and free-for-alls we sometimes had. Remarkable. Compared to all the other nations of the world, ours is very young. Not too many generations ago all our ancestors lived in some other part of the globe. Where did these Adams, Martins come from? Claude and Ruby traced Mom's family to Wales. Chances are that the Harringtons also came from there and from Scotland and Ireland. I'm convinced that many of the Adams tribe came from England. So many of the old ballads Mom used to sing reflect English history. The Romanish lady is one. It seemed to tell a tale about a Roman Catholic Queen of England. But it was in some of the expressions used in speaking by Grandpa and Grandma that I found most evidence. As a child I wondered at them. April was April, pennies were coppers, Kentucky was Kentuck, U was simply yet, R was air, and old was old. There were many more of these that were not part of Mom's speech, so they must have come from the Adams family. I wondered about that strange dialect until one day in high school class in English literature. We began the study of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and there were all those strange words. Straight out of Mere Old England as written by Chaucer between the years of 1387 and 1400. I found Canterbury Tales easier to read than some of my classmates, for I know what more of the unfamiliar words meant. As you glance over our family tree, you won't find any famous people, no outstanding politicians or world shakers. But you will find honest, reliable people, made of the stuff it took to build this country, step by step. They were unusually proud, stubborn, independent individualists who, in most cases, wanted only to be left alone to build their lives and provide for the families in ways that most appealed to them. They became merchants, farmers, preachers, teachers, doctors, soldiers, miners. Most of them were entrepreneurs, people who started and ran a business to fulfill both their desire to provide a living and to be their own man. These ancestors brought us along the way to where and what we are today, for better or worse. And I find no reason for being ashamed to show up on this tree. Also, if we managed to push the family along as honestly as they did then, those who follow us may be glad that they are in this tree with us. In discussing her own children, Mom once said, "None of them has ever been in jail or in the insane asylum, so we must have done something right." I think they did a great many things right. Eva Purdom. May, 1968.